Imagine a world where the greatest era of human knowledge never collapsed, where the libraries of Baghdad were never burned, where the scholars of Cordoba never fled, where the mathematics, medicine, astronomy, and philosophy of the Islamic Golden Age kept compounding century after century, building on itself like interest in an account that never closed. We take for granted that Europe led the modern world, but that story almost didn't happen. And another one nearly did. To understand what was lost, we must first understand what was built. Beginning in the 8th century under the Abbasid Caliphate, a deliberate project of knowledge gathering transformed Baghdad into the intellectual capital of the known world. The Bait al-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom, employed translators, mathematicians, astronomers, physicians, and philosophers from every culture: Arab, Persian, Greek, Indian, Syriac. By the year 900, no city on earth concentrated more human knowledge in one place. The achievements of this era were not abstract. Al-Khwarizmi invented algebra here, giving the world a mathematical language it still uses today. Ibn al-Haytham in Cairo wrote the Book of Optics, laying the foundations of the scientific method 6 centuries before Europe would credit it to Bacon or Descartes. Al-Biruni calculated the circumference of the earth to within 1% of its true value in the year 1000 AD. These were not incremental advances. They were civilizational leaps. But then came the catastrophe. In 1258, the Mongol army of Hulagu Khan surrounded Baghdad. When the city fell after a brief siege, what followed was one of the most devastating acts of cultural destruction in human history. The libraries of the House of Wisdom were emptied into the Tigris River. Eyewitnesses recorded that the river ran black with ink for days. Hundreds of thousands of manuscripts, centuries of accumulated knowledge, were lost forever. The Abbasid Caliphate ended in a single week. Our point of divergence is this. What if the Mongols never reached Baghdad? What if the death of the great Khan Monka in 1259, which in our timeline caused Hulagu to withdraw his forces from the Middle East, had instead occurred 1 year earlier in 1257, before the campaign on Baghdad even began? Hulagu turns back, the Abbasid Caliph survives, the House of Wisdom stands, the scholars return to their manuscripts, and the most productive intellectual tradition in human history simply continues. In this alternate world, the scholars of Baghdad don't scatter, they double down. By 1300, a new generation of mathematicians builds on Al-Khwarizmi's algebra and Ibn al-Haytham's optics to develop what we would recognize as calculus. 2.5 centuries before Newton and Leibniz independently arrived at the same idea in Europe. Differential equations describe planetary motion with new precision. Astronomical observations accumulate across an unbroken chain of institutions from Baghdad to Cairo to Samarkand. Medicine advances with equal ferocity. Ibn Sina's Canon of Medicine, already the definitive medical textbook across Eurasia, is now extended and revised every generation rather than treated as a fixed authority. By 1350, Islamic physicians in this alternate timeline have mapped the circulatory system, identified bacterial contamination in water supplies, and developed systematic quarantine protocols. When the Black Death strikes in the 1340s, the cities of the Islamic world do not simply pray, they isolate, filter, and survive at far higher rates than in our history. The unbroken Islamic scholarly tradition now produces something Europe would not develop for centuries: peer review. By 1380, Islamic academies in Baghdad, Cairo, and Fez have institutionalized the practice of scholars formally challenging and verifying each other's findings before publication. This single procedural innovation accelerates the pace of discovery exponentially. Errors that persisted in European natural philosophy for generations are corrected here within decades. Knowledge stops being a collection of authorities and starts being a living, self-correcting system. By 1400, the economic implications become impossible to ignore. The Islamic world sits at the crossroads of every major trade route. the Silk Road, the Indian Ocean spice trade, the Trans-Saharan gold routes, the Mediterranean, an Islamic civilization that never fragmented, that maintained political coherence across the Abbasid successor states, now applies its scientific advances directly to navigation, shipbuilding, and commerce. Magnetic compasses are refined, astrolabe accuracy is doubled, deep-sea navigation charts cover the Indian Ocean with a detail that no European cartographer could match. Here is where the alternate timeline begins to diverge most dramatically from our own. In our history, it was Portuguese and Spanish sailors who first reached the Americas, arriving with weapons, missionaries, and the legal doctrine of conquest. In this world, the Atlantic is first crossed by Islamic merchant navigators in the late 1400s, carrying trade goods, astronomical instruments, and a commercial tradition built on negotiation rather than subjugation. They do not come to claim, they come to exchange. The first sustained contact between the Old World and the Americas is not a conquest, it is a trade route. The consequences for the Americas are profound and different, though not necessarily better. Islamic contact with the New World brings its own trade networks, its own diseases, its own ambitions. But critically, it also brings a civilization that has spent 700 years developing medical knowledge, which means the catastrophic death toll of European diseases, which killed up to 90% of some indigenous populations in our history, is partially mitigated by more advanced quarantine protocols. First contact is still devastating, but it is not total annihilation. Back in Europe, the absence of Islamic fragmentation creates a continent-wide intellectual crisis of a very different kind. In our history, the European Renaissance was fueled largely by Islamic scholarship, rediscovered Greek texts translated by Arab scholars, algebra from al-Khwarizmi, optics from Ibn al-Haytham. In this alternate world, that knowledge never stops flowing directly from its source. Europe does not rediscover knowledge, it accesses it live. The result is a renaissance that begins a century earlier, moves faster, and is far more openly collaborative with the Islamic world. The Industrial Revolution in our world began in Britain in the 1760s, driven by coal, steam, and a specific confluence of Protestant work ethic, colonial raw materials, and protected markets. In this alternate world, the preconditions for industrialization exist in the Islamic world more than a century earlier. Advanced metallurgy inherited from Persian and Indian traditions, mathematical precision from the Baghdad school, and direct access to vast coal deposits in Persia and Central Asia. The world's first steam-powered textile mills do not open in Manchester, they open in Isfahan. Without a European industrial revolution leading world history, colonialism as we know it simply does not happen. The specific combination of industrial military advantage and cultural supremacy that allowed small European nations to conquer most of the world in the 18th and 19th centuries never materializes. Africa is not carved up at a conference table in Berlin in 1885. India is not governed from London. The Americas are not plantation economies built on enslaved African labor on the scale our world experienced. The map of the world in 1800 looks almost unrecognizable. Language itself would be different. In our world, English became the global lingua franca through British imperial expansion and American economic dominance, both products of the European Industrial Revolution. In this alternate world, Arabic, already the language of science, trade, and religion across 3 continents, continues its expansion along Islamic trade routes. By 1900, Arabic and its derived trade creoles are spoken from West Africa to Southeast Asia as the world's dominant languages of commerce and scholarship. The Internet, had it been invented, would default not to ASCII, but to Arabic script. Science and medicine in this alternate 20th century are operating from a 700-year head start. Germ theory, established in Islamic medicine by the 1400s in this timeline, leads to antibiotics being developed by the mid-1700s, 2 centuries before Alexander Fleming's accidental discovery in our history. Smallpox is eradicated by 1800. The diseases that killed hundreds of millions in our 19th and 20th centuries, cholera, tuberculosis, typhoid, are controlled epidemics rather than global killers. Global life expectancy in 1900 in this alternate world is roughly what ours was in 1970. What about democracy and governance? This is perhaps the most contested question of the alternate timeline. The Islamic scholarly tradition produced rigorous jurisprudence, consultative councils called shura, and sophisticated civic administration. But it did not produce the specific form of liberal parliamentary democracy that emerged from post-Reformation Europe. In this alternate world, governance would likely evolve along different lines, perhaps a form of scholarly meritocracy guided by Islamic legal tradition, perhaps something we have no name for yet. Whether it would be more or less just than our system is a question that cannot be answered easily. By the 20th century of this alternate world, the human species is not divided into a dominant West and a developing world. There is no Cold War between capitalism and communism. Those ideologies were products of specific European industrialization patterns that did not occur here. There are multiple great civilizational powers, an Islamic superstate stretching from Morocco to Central Asia, a Chinese sphere of influence across East Asia, independent African confederacies with their own industrial bases, and a fragmented but developed Europe that industrialized later and less violently. The 20th century is not a century of world wars, it is a century of negotiation. Here is the staggering conclusion. In our world, humanity reached the moon in 1969. In this alternate world, with an industrial revolution 100 years earlier, a medical system 200 years more advanced, and a mathematical tradition that never broke, the calculations suggest a spacefaring civilization emerging by the 1890s. Not as science fiction, but as a natural extension of a 700-year unbroken chain of precision astronomy, materials, science, and engineering. The universe that our civilization is only just beginning to explore may already have been mapped in another version of history by ships bearing the crescent. What the Islamic Golden Age teaches us, even in our timeline, even in its truncated, interrupted form, is that no civilization has a monopoly on human genius. The capacity for science, art, philosophy, and discovery is distributed equally across all of humanity. What differs is which civilizations are given the stability, the resources, and the freedom from catastrophe to let that genius flourish. The Mongols took a flame, but the flame was never unique. Somewhere, in the vast space of possible histories, it never went out. Follow Altered Empires for more history that will rewire your brain.